All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to today's panel discussion, The Art and Science of Achieving Quantum-Ready Security. My name is Ryan Sanders. I'll be your host today as we dive into a topic that I think has been top of mind for many organizations, and that is, of course, quantum computing and what it means specifically for the world of security. But there's a lot of hype out there, right? And it's hard to know where to begin. So today, we want to really cut through some of those common misconceptions and the hype and think practically about what it means to be quantum ready and what it'll take to get there. And we'll take a look at it from two different perspectives. So first, there's the art. There's the art of building a strategy and a plan to prepare for the changes ahead. That includes identifying the risks, scoping out the impact on your organization, and of course, training and equipping your teams for success. And if you're an IT or security leader, we saw many of you registered today, CISOs, directors, VPs. This is likely a big focus for you. But there's also the science. It's the science of testing and implementing these new quantum resistant algorithms that we've been hearing about and the technologies to support them in your lab environment and eventually, of course, in production. And if you're an engineer or an architect, there are many of you here as well, and that's likely top of mind for you. But no matter which side of that equation you're on, whether quantum computers become a practical threat tomorrow or 10 years from now, we know that the preparations won't be trivial and the time to start is now. So on that note, let's get started. First, I want to thank all of our speakers for taking the time to join us today. I must admit, 8 a.m. is a bit early for me. Chris, maybe you too, but on the other hand, it's 7 a.m. for you, Jeff, and it's 10 or 11 p.m. for you, David. So I can't complain. I've got my coffee. I'm good. But thanks again for joining. Why don't we get a quick round of introductions in? If you could each just tell us a bit about yourselves, what you do, and maybe one thing that I think we can all relate to right now, which is how many cups of coffee it takes you to get through the day. So why don't we start with you, Jeff, and then we'll go to David and then Chris.
Sure. Thanks for that, Ryan. I guess the best way to describe myself is I have a day job, right? I work at Wells Fargo. I was the lead crypto architect for about 5 years. And then last year, I switched over to our internal post-quantum cryptography program. And so that's what I pretty much do every day of the week. But I also have another job where I do industry standards. And so I'm here representing X9F4, which is the cybersecurity and cryptographic work group out of the X9 standards arena. We focus in the financial services. But of course, I have to look at a whole bunch of other standards groups, IEEE, IETF, ITU, and NIST, and so on. And it's a huge lift trying to keep up with all that stuff. And then I guess I got the weekend stuff. I'm actually a writer. I've got the book series called Security Without Obscurity, and book 5's coming out in February of next year. Keep your fingers crossed.
Wow. Awesome. Well, that's good to hear. And I think it's enough to keep up with all those acronyms too. There are a lot of acronyms that we'll probably go through today. But David, why don't you kick us off next?
Yeah, there definitely are a lot of acronyms. So I guess my chief claim to fame is I'm the lead developer for the Bouncy Castle cryptography APIs. And that's largely the role that I fulfill at Keyfactor. So a lot of what I look at is really more in terms of, as Jeff looks at constructing standards, I'm really more about implementing them and also providing implementations to the actual algorithms themselves, following the draft standards for that and the way that system's all evolving.
Awesome. Well, thanks, David, for joining us. And Chris, last but not least.
Chris Hickman, Chief Security Officer at Keyfactor. No claim to fame, period. To answer your coffee question, I don't think I can count that high, which is why David does the math. And but my main role here is to help customers be successful with implementing Keyfactor technology, and beyond that, just helping our customers prepare in this particular case for what's coming around the wave of quantum. I often refer to it as there's a wave out on the horizon that is probably going to turn out to be an epic wave, tsunami type of incident, and a lot of organizations are still standing on the beach going, "Hey, isn't that pretty?" And I don't want our customers or anybody to be stuck in that, because I think for the larger community of organizations out there, the potential of harm and damage is greater if they just continue watching the wave roll in.
Yep, agreed. And Chris, I think your claim to fame is definitely analogies. You give the best analogies for everything, so I'm hoping you whip out a few more in the conversation. But real quick, before we get into that discussion, I just want to set some ground rules for the audience, but also for our speakers. So first off, for the audience, we do have some questions lined up, of course, but we'd love to hear your questions. We'd much rather answer those. So don't wait till the end. Feel free to drop those in at any time, and we'll try to answer them as we go along rather than waiting to the end. Secondly, be sure to check out the attachments tab at the end after the discussion. We've got some great resources in there that'll help you take some next steps. And then lastly, this one's for you speakers. Disagreements are welcome, so long as we can all leave here as friends at the end of the session. Happy to hear those. But this is as much a discussion as it is a Q&A, so feel free to chime in, interrupt each other. That is all good here. But with that, let's get into it. And Chris, I think we'll start off with you. And just with a baseline, really, let's start out with kind of why we're here today, this concept of quantum readiness. What does it mean, and why is it important that we're here talking about it now?
I think actually, Ryan, you articulated it very well in your intro. Just some of the salient points, right? Quantum ready is not a technology per se. It's not a policy per se. It's not a training event per se. It's everything. If we look at what the change that is coming to cryptography, irrespective of whether quantum computers, as you mentioned, are ready tomorrow or in 10 years, to the point where they can become a risk and a threat to our current cybersecurity practices, there's going to be a fundamental change in cryptography because the threat exists at any point in time along that timeline or at some point in time in the future. And organizations really need to start looking at what they've taken, I think, for granted in a lot of respects, which is crypto. Most organizations have just sort of become complacent to the fact that crypto exists, and in most cases it's pretty good, not always, and they just don't know much about what's actually going on within their crypto ecosystem. And when we look at the potential impact of being ready, it all starts with understanding what is using crypto in my organization today and how is it being used. And most organizations couldn't tell you that. They wouldn't have that sort of detailed inventory of what types of algorithms are being used along, what types of business or lines of business are being protected, what's the technology behind it, what's the codependent technology, so on and so forth. And really, so when we talk about quantum readiness, it's the organization's ability to have that knowledge to be able to take action as appropriate to defend themselves against what is a potential future risk.
All right. Yeah, I think to use another analogy, plumbing or electrical, I've heard is a common one, is that you don't think about that. It just works. It's behind the walls, but it works in front of the scenes. You don't really take a look behind your drywall all the time to take a look until something major happens and you need to rip and replace all of it. So it's definitely a major renovation that's going to need to happen as we move forward. But also, Jeff, curious to hear your thoughts, just your day job perspective at Wells Fargo, what quantum readiness means there.
Well, first of all, I love the title of this talk, Art and Science, because cryptography has always been a combination of both. I could even argue that because I do standards, I'm more on the art side, whereas David does the implementation. He's more on the science side. But even if you get down into the individual algorithms and the key lengths and the protocols, there's always a bit of art to do what you refer to as that plumbing, right? Where does a connector go? What kind of, faucet ratchet do I need to do something? And so, yeah, it's all a little bit artful and always will be. When it comes to cryptography, there's no such thing as bulletproof, right? And I'll use another analogy. When you look at Underwriter Laboratories and you want to go buy a safe, right? They don't say this is a bulletproof safe. This is impervious. It's uncrackable. There's no such thing. You can buy a safe that, according to their evaluations, takes 4 hours to break into, or maybe you want one that takes 24 hours or 3 weeks. That's sort of what cryptography is like. You can set these strengths, these levels, however you want to classify it. And this does this very well with the algorithms. But at the end of the day, everything is always going to be broken, whether it's just longevity due to, Moore's algorithm, because computers are getting bigger, faster. They always will. Cryptography is an evolution, always has been, always will be.
Yep, absolutely. And I think, yeah, like you said, will continue to be. This is the first round of new algorithms that we've seen come through NIST, but certainly won't be the last. And I'm sure we'll dive into that a little bit more. But on that note, Jeff, I think this is something we talked about. We met actually a couple of weeks ago at ICMC, which I think in a lot of ways is at the forefront of a lot of this conversation. But there's a lot of terminology floating around there. If you look at vendors, and even Keyfactor, we at Keyfactor have to be cautious about the terminology that we use. I think there's a lot of misconceptions or maybe even misleading terms out there. There's post-quantum, there's quantum safe, there's quantum resistant, quantum ready, like we've just talked about. So maybe we can get into a little bit about what those mean, and if any of those terms are misleading, kind of why that is, and how we should think about them.
Yeah, I prefer the term quantum resistant for exactly what I said earlier. Is you can't guarantee anything, right? And of course, the reference to quantum refers to the inevitable advent of quantum computers, and they have the good side and the bad side. The good side is they're going to solve really complex business problems that today we have to rough order of magnitude estimate using classical computers. So the quantum computer is going to be really good at solving really complex linear equations. That's the good side. The bad side is they're also going to slice through some of our legacy cryptography, RSA, Diffie-Hellman, elliptic curve. So those are all going to have to be replaced. So hence the term post-quantum. So that's a good term. I like that. But resistant, I think, is the most accurate description. Everything else is a little interpretation of that word, or some of it is a little hype. And, you got some market terminology floating around out there. That's inevitable.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's because of marketers like me that is, but we try our best.
Yeah, I'm curious. So if as an industry, we haven't done ourselves a little bit of a disservice by calling it post-quantum, where everybody sort of is now waiting for quantum to do something sometimes. And it's sort of become a wait state for a lot of organizations versus a proactive, next generation of cryptography that is also quantum resistance. Any thoughts on that one, Jeff or David?
Yeah, I'd definitely say, I would definitely say that the move to using phrases like quantum resistant and quantum ready is a positive thing, because anyone who has the impression that post-quantum is really about just waiting for quantum computers to arrive is definitely putting themselves in a bad spot. I mean, one of the issues, of course, that we're dealing with now is that while quantum computers themselves have basically become something of an engineering problem to solve, rather than a question of if it's actually possible, the truth is, of course, that there will be people who are probably trying to capture data now in the expectation of quantum computer becoming available, say, 10 years hence. And so for that reason, I think it's very important that organizations are actually looking at what they are doing and trying to work out now what they need to preserve and protect. And at the same time, paying attention to what's going on with the standards so they're in a position to start adopting them quickly when they become available. Because the reality is none of us actually know. The only thing that I'd like to be certain about really in this whole thing is that when somebody actually gets a quantum computer that's cryptographically significant working, I'd just like to be able to read it in the newspaper and think, cool, this will be fun. There's an alternative scenario. I don't want to go there.
So, David, to your point, and you made some really good ones there. As I said earlier, cryptography has always been an evolution. So we've seen what we call cryptographic transitions. And in fact, we think we coined that term in an IEEE paper we wrote back in 2006. So we've been looking at this for a long time. This is not the first one. We had to, in the financial services, we had to switch everything over to DES because we weren't consistent. Then we had to move from DES to triple DES. Now we're still trying to move from triple DES to AES. We had to go from SHA-1 to SHA-2 and so on and so on. So this is not the first rodeo, as they say here in Texas. And we're going to see the next one, and there's going to be another one and another one. So it's never going to end. And that's why eventually we're going to talk about crypto agility. How do you get from point A to point B and then C, D, E, and the entire alphabet?
Yeah, actually, I think that's very true. The point that it's never going to end, because the other misconception we definitely don't want people to come away from talks like this about is that, NIST have gone and they've produced 3 draft standards so far. There's more on the way. BSI in Germany are also doing similar things. I mean, there's a lot of work going on, but the reality is that, like everything else, there will be more standards coming. So even the post-quantum algorithms we're reviewing now, they may turn out to have issues. There may turn out to be much better algorithms to implement. For example, the lithium, if you're trying to generate a signature, you need at least 160K of memory at the moment. This is an expense that not a lot of people are necessarily prepared to bear.
Yeah.
So yeah, the idea of agility and the idea of being able to, make transitions and understand the engineering and implications behind what's required to move from one algorithm set to another have suddenly become quite real. The good old days, where you could just use SHA-1 and then just leave it that way for 20 years, are probably no longer with us. And, the transitions we've gone through before, in a sense, have really just been rehearsals for what a real transition now looks like, which is where we're going now.
And we measure those transition in years because that's what it takes.
Yeah, I think one of the popular misconceptions that I hear from time to time is, it's just going to be change the algorithm. It's not a flip a bit type of approach to getting aligned into a quantum ready or a quantum readiness state. It is an entire ecosystem reevaluation. And it is important for folks to remember that. And once you've done it, to these gentlemen point, you can continue to use it going forward, right? So once you've sort of got all your endpoints mapped out, your automation in place, you know how you're going to deal with graceful rollover that doesn't put your business at additional risk. You can continue to reuse those plans and those infrastructures and those, even down to products, to make sure that when something changes, you can respond and mitigate risk in a timely manner.
Yeah, and to that point, I think we're a little. I know we want to talk about crypto agility, but I think there's a lot of other elements in there too, right? I mean, you have Google, who this year proposed reducing the lifespan of TLS certs down to 90 days. That requires organizations to be much more agile. Beyond just changing the algorithms, there's a lot of other kind of impetus or reasons why you'd want to become more agile in your cryptography practice. So I think we'll get into that a little bit more, but just want to take us up to a higher level and let's talk about the art now. What does it take to think about this strategically and prepare your teams? And from the perspective of a CISO or an IT leader, what are some of those things that you really need to start thinking about as you plan for these big changes ahead? And Chris, I'll point this one to you first, but I think everyone can probably have a say on this one. But just trying to think about that perspective, I think you've talked about a couple of things, but going through what that strategy might look like.
Yeah, and I think it's a struggle, to be very honest with you. I think a lot of business leaders would struggle going to their board and saying, I need funding for a problem that's 10 years away that may or may not happen. And so, understanding that is a great place to start. But to your point earlier, Ryan, right, there's things going on in crypto, even within our current sets, that are making us potentially vulnerable or ineffective, right? Like the change of life cycles. There may be changes required to other cryptographic standards absent of quantum computing at the time, right? You may need to, there may be vulnerabilities found in RSA or something like that. I mean, we just don't know. I mean, it's an evolution. It's an ongoing process. You don't know what you don't know. Organizations are starting to look at crypto as a critical asset, and it needs the same attention in a lot of respects of other critical assets. If you've kind of heard me get on my soapbox from time to time, you've got business continuity plans for everything in your organization. Do you have a business continuity plan for changes in crypto? And because those are fundamental things that need to happen, right? How am I going to be able to keep my business up and running as different threats, risks, and changes present themselves? And so it's really an approach that says, look at things from an ecosystem perspective. It's not, as I said before, a single bit. It's not going to be, drop in this new executable and away you go. What's codependent? If you've got PKI, you've got HSMs. You've got cards, you've got consumers, you've got endpoints, you've got RAs, you've got validators, you've got all these things going on inside of your ecosystem that all have to talk to each other, right? And we've always taken it for granted that they talk RSA or they talk ECC. One of the interesting things with the quantum world is you're basically going from I like to say a bass and treble to adjust your sound to an entire soundboard of 900 different potential settings that you can turn and change knobs on. So there needs to be testing to get that compatibility, and that is going to take time. The standards are coming out, but the standards are actually relatively broad in the sense that there are multiple different options. It's not just chocolate or vanilla. And organizations need to start understanding what that means. Comment has already been made about the key sizes and the size of pipe that's required for these things that we just take for granted, like signing, right? There's going to be an impact there. So as organizations look at it, and if I was sitting there trying to justify how do I start to get my organization ready, visibility, inventory, understanding what the impact is, testing, getting familiar with the terminology, following what's going on with great organizations like X9 and so on and so forth. Also creating that supply chain piece of it, right? So it's not just you anymore, right? Most organizations have cloud presence. They have supply chain concerns. They have all of these things, again, need to work together. And need to be ready at around the same time. So if you want to get to a point of being quantum resistant, you can't have your supply chain still be on RSA. It would be the same as your supply chain being on DES and you being at AES. It's not all going to work together. So really, it's just getting a handle on where are all the moving parts in my organization. What's important to me? Where does the greatest risk present themselves? Dave has already said, made the statement that there are things today being stolen to decrypt later. And I think that's something organizations need to put their heads around and say, okay, what is that data? Why would it be interesting? And protect those critical assets sooner rather than later. And that's how you start to put together that business case that says, yes, this is a future problem. And I don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but the impacts to the business start today. And then, luckily we have things like regulatory statements and things like that are starting to come around, right? Where if I'm a publicly traded company, I now have to report on my a SEC filing if I have a security incident, so on and so forth. So hopefully those things will help bolster some of the conversation in the boardrooms that this is a critical element of making like I said, a business continuity plan for crypto.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned the business case, the boardroom. I think that's a big piece of this, getting an understanding at that level. Jeff, curious about your perspective of kind of how that happens. How do you build that business case or that understanding? Because this is, like I mentioned, plumbing, electricity. It's just not something we think about on a daily basis, but it's very important to keep things running. So how do you kind of get that understanding?
Yeah, there's so many points there. Where to begin? First of all, analogies are great. You can convey really good information. The problem is you can't take them too far, or they might imply something that's not true. So, for example, a lot of folks say, well, Q day, right? It's sort of like Y2K when we had to go from a 2-digit to 4-digit year. That's a reasonable analogy, except you don't know when it's going to happen. We can't predict the exact date. Where Y2K, we knew exactly down to the second when it was going to happen. And another thing is, once it was done, it was done. It was over. We made the transition. We moved on. With Q Day, since we don't know exactly when it's going to happen, you're never going to be done. Like we said earlier, crypto is an evolution. So that's sort of a false implication there that, once it's here, we're done and we move on. The other issue is with Q Day, and we talked about this at a group called FSISAC. It's a consortium of the banks and the merchants. And someone said, well, okay, what would Q Day look like? This was an open discussion we had at one of the online face-to-face meetings. And the answer was, well, if somebody builds a cryptographic relevant quantum computer which is CRQC, which can be mispronounced as croc, which I think was a bad choice. But anyway, that's what it is. We're not going to know. Someone's going to have it, maybe a nation state, and no one, they're not going to make an announcement saying, we've got it, we can break your crypto. It's just going to start happening. And eventually we're going to realize somebody did it. And that could take, weeks, months, years before we come to that realization. So that's part of the problem with that Y2K analogy or Q-Day. Okay. That's one thing. The other thing is you can do the risk. You have to describe the risk. You have to explain, this is how we use cryptography. This is what we rely on it. This is where it is. This is the pervasiveness of it. And if all these things get broken overnight, we have a huge problem. So you have to explain that risk. You got to describe it in the dollars and the cents and the business. And then you have to move on to, oh, by the way, we need to start working on this now. And then you get into what David mentioned, the harvest now, decrypt later issues. And actually, harvest now, decrypt later is not new. It's been around for decades. Because if they can, scrape my encrypted stuff off the wire, right, off the internet, whatever communications I'm using, they're expecting to possibly crack into a web server, break into a site, compromise somebody, whether it's, they offer them a bribe or it's blackmail, whatever. And if they can get the keys, they can get to your data. So this is not new. What's new is they don't have to go after you directly. They can capture the data indirectly. And then sometime in the future, they call it the time traveler's attack, I think. Sometime in the future, that quantum computer will be available and they will be able to take those public keys, break them, figure out your private keys, and then get to your session keys. And then all your data is now compromised.
All right.
I know that was a lot.
Yeah, no, that's kind of what I think what we need to hear. And I think it's very relevant to the question that we had pop up in the chat, which was from Lauren, who asked, do you see post-quantum or quantum ready being a single event, i.e. adopting processes, procedures, and algorithms that are quantum resistant, or will it be the start of a continuous program? I think we've answered that, but I think, Lauren, you're also thinking about it in the right way, which is adopting processes and procedures before thinking even about the algorithms. I think that's going to be a very phased approach, and compatibility will be one of the biggest challenges, I think, for a lot of organizations. But on that note, I think we talk a lot about crypto agility. We mentioned it earlier. So just it'd be great to set the tone on, there's a lot of different definitions out there. We'll set our own in this conversation. And Jeff, maybe I'll give that to you, is what is crypto agility and what does it mean to be crypto agile? And then David, I know we talked about this as well at the ICMC conference. So it'd be great to hear your perspective after that.
So if I can use this phraseology, crypto agility is sort of the holy grail of cryptography and key management. I always say cryptography and key management, because a lot of times it's the key management that's the bad part. You could have the best algorithm in the world with the strongest keys in the world, but if you don't manage them correctly, you're still going to be vulnerable and you're still going to lose your data. The problem is there's no good solid definition of crypto agility. David and I could probably talk about this for days on end. I mentioned the FSISAC group the other day. They have a PQC work group, and they did publish a paper on how do you approach the problem, start with your inventory, figure out where your crypto is and so on. It's a pretty good paper. But I've challenged that group to say, give me a definition of crypto agility. And we're actually working on that right now. We've got some words on paper. We're kicking some ideas around, and we're probably going to publish something, but I don't think it's going to come out anytime soon. I know I didn't answer your question.
No, that I think it was a good overview, but yeah, David, it'd be good to get your perspective on crypto agility. And again, it's hard to define, right? But I think we have a good understanding of what it is based on what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, it is hard to define. And I think the other issue too is like the term crypto agility has been around for quite a while now. And to get back to Jeff's thing about the issues you run with are not analogies. In some ways, you can run into the same issues with talking about the past and expecting it to be like the future. What we're used to in terms of, algorithm evolution has just been steady increases in key sizes. And then occasionally you'll go from SHA-1 to SHA-2. and more recently we had the introduction of SHA-3. You know, fundamentally the algorithms in terms of how you can use them and everything are largely the same. One of the issues that we're going to run into with the quantum algorithms and the effect that it's going to have on what our concept of crypto agility is that it's no longer just a matter of replacing one algorithm with another. There are techniques that we currently use for key transport, for example, that are largely based around algorithms like RSA and Diffie-Hellman. The algorithms that are available in the quantum realm are completely different in terms of how they actually function. So this actually affects your protocols. It affects not just the key sizes and things like that, but the actual mechanics of the way things are done under the hood. So yeah, people really need to be prepared to change in more ways than they imagine. And this is one of the things about the necessity to start with of having an inventory, you know, of what you're currently doing. Because the problem with being agile is if you're going to leap from one rock to another one, which is hopefully a bit higher over the water level, you need to know where your feet are when you start leaping. Otherwise, it's likely to go very badly for you. Yeah. I hope that sort of covers it.
No, absolutely. I think, when it comes to crypto agility as well, I think a lot of the things that we've talked about that will prepare you for the future are things that would benefit you today. We've talked about, you mentioned inventory. That's something organizations likely do or should already have in place, is a solid inventory of the key certificates algorithms that are in use across their business. So that they can prepare for a change like this, but also so that they can identify risks currently. I mean, we see a lot of misuse and theft of, for instance, SSH keys or code signing keys. We see certificates expiring and taking down systems like Starlink, for example, where a ground station, a single certificate installed there takes down a network. So these are things that are impacting organizations today, and the things they need to do to prepare for post-quantum, I think, or a post-quantum world, are things that would benefit them currently. But if we talk about a level deeper now, let's get into the science. I think we've described it as the periodic table, right? If you go back to grade school, there was RSA and there was ECC, and we knew those really well. We know those elements. We know how they work in our environments. But now the periodic table is growing. We have these new elements there, and we don't know how they're going to react and respond in our environment. So it's about testing those in a lab and working with them to better understand how they work, and then eventually moving those to production. So if we think about these new algorithms, just generally speaking, David, what are the new algorithms coming down the pipeline, and how are they different from those that we use today? I think you touched on that a little bit, but if you could dive just a bit deeper there.
Sure. So I guess a couple of things. I mean, one of the changes, of course, is obviously the underlying maths that's supporting these algorithms has changed. And while that's exciting in terms of the fact that we found a whole new branch of mathematics that we can exploit for the terms of public key cryptography, we obviously don't have the kind of history that we had with the previous set of maths. So, you know, there may still be some surprises in store for us. Mm-hmm. The other thing, of course, is that what we're looking at in terms of how the actual algorithms themselves behave. So I kind of touched on before with key transport. The assumption's always been with RSA, for example, there's a very simple protocol in terms of if you're trying to establish a new key somewhere else, you know, you generate a symmetric key, you encrypt it using your RSA key, it gets sent to somebody else who then decrypts it with their RSA private key, and the two of you have a conversation. The key encapsulation mechanisms, they're known, which is one of the features of the quantum algorithms, don't work like that at all. You actually have a public key, you generate what's called an encapsulation, and as part of that process of generating encapsulation, it also gives you a secret key. You then send the encapsulation to the other party, and they then use that encapsulation to recover the secret key that you originally calculated as well, using their private key. So, you know, compared to the original way we looked at it, so with RSA, there is a public key, there is a private key, but the way they're actually interacting is quite different. So that's quite important. Now, this is going to affect everything as well, though, signatures also. So what we're currently looking at the moment with NIST is they've just had a round. The first primary stage of the post-quantum competition, as it were, has finished. So we now have a couple of new signature algorithms and a new key encapsulation mechanism, all of which have moderately cool names like Kyber and dilithium, and seem to be given, more standard calming names like LMS, DSS, and things like that, to make sure they fit with the sort of government agenda that goes behind these standards. But there are additional algorithms now. There's also a round 4 where there's some additional key encapsulation mechanisms which are being looked at, which are based on yet another area of cryptography called coding theory. And likewise, there's also additional rounds taking place for signature algorithms. So we've got a lattice-based signature algorithm, and we've got what's called a hash-based signature algorithm at the moment. They want to find other techniques, so to speak, to make sure that we can also generate signatures. Partly, and this is the thing, the unknown territory is that we have things like Shor's algorithm and that, which are really thought experiments in a sense, in terms of the way they evolved and the way they were discussed and the way they've been used. The reality, though, is, as you know from personal experience, if you work in this area, there's a huge difference between being able to talk about what you can do with a particular piece of technology to actually having that piece of technology sitting on your desk. And then you can just start doing things like, if I do this, what's going to happen? So the other thing that's going on is that, the standards bodies are all trying to, broaden the range of algorithms and the family of algorithms that are available. So to deal with this issue that, we could still find ourselves in a situation where we might go, okay, well, lattice is going to be great, but it may turn out that, lattice will be great for 5 years and not 50. In the same way as, say, back in the retro years of 2000, a 512-bit RSA key was positively bulletproof. But you'd be insane to be using a key that small now. I mean, there's arguments now about using 2048-bit, whether that's actually safe enough. So things do change.
Right. Yeah, and curious to get your perspective too, Chris and Jeff, but mine is honestly that dilithium, Falcon, Kyber, those are way cooler names than what they've brought them down to now. Now we're stuck with more acronyms. So I wish they would have stuck with the original names, but I see a reason to standardize.
I'm pretty sure there's a government system somewhere that doesn't allow you to put more than 5 random letters in, which is why they, had to go that way. So,
yeah, exactly. But Jeff, Chris, your perspective on that?
Well, David makes some really good points around, we know what the current algorithms proposed are, and we know what, we have round 3, which is being published. We have round 4, which they're still working on. And now there's a new call for another round of digital signatures. So we know there's going to be at least 3 waves in this ongoing effort, right? And there could be more in the future. He also pointed out that we know what the current, and we don't talk a lot about cryptanalysis, right? These are the algorithms that are breaking the cryptography. So Shor's algorithm can do factorization, and it's applicable to discrete logs, which gets you breaking Diffie-Hellman and the elliptic curve flavor of Diffie-Hellman. We don't know what's going to come down the pipe. Somebody may come up with a really great algorithm, either on a classical computer, because it hasn't been invented yet, the algorithm, not the computer itself, of course. Or once the quantum computers are up and running, somebody may come up with another really great cryptanalysis that's going to break some of the existing stuff that's currently proposed. So we have to be flexible enough or agile enough, hence crypto agility, to be able to say, oh, I was using this, but now I have to go to this.
And we did see a little bit of foreshadowing of that with the first round of candidates. So it's not that far off to suspect that as things mature and have time to sit. And to me, the interesting part is Q day the day that there is a crypto capable quantum computer, or is Q day the day that we suddenly realize that the algorithms do have faults because quantum computers are actually that powerful and expose them? There's an argument to be made that you can't test what you can't test, and if to David's point, if you're only testing it in theory and not in practicality, you're probably missing part of it. But that doesn't lend itself to, well, let's wait and see. It lends itself much more to the conversation that says we have to be prepared for anything and everything, because we just don't know exactly what that's going to look like. To borrow from the Marvel universe, right? The timeline is about the fork, and we don't know what that timeline is going to be. So lots of things can happen, lots of possibilities there. Be ready for as many as you can, or you can just sit around and see what happens. I don't think see what happens is the right approach for any business.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I have to admit, David, when you said quantum realm, my mind went immediately to Marvel. But it's I think it's not all about the yeah, it's exciting, but it's not all about the algorithms, right? We've talked a lot about those now. Spent about 10 minutes just on the algorithms. I'm sure we could talk a whole hour about those or more. But of course, it's about upskilling your staff. It's about testing for compatibility, working with your vendors. There's so many elements to this equation, and so many different kind of advice that we prescribe throughout this webinar. But what is the best place that people can look from? And I'd like to hear from each of you just to begin understanding this and working toward a solution. What are some of the best resources that you've found out there to be able to get started on this? And maybe we can start with you, Jeff.
Well, there's more than one, right? Certainly NIST, because that's giving you where the algorithms are and when they're getting ready to be published and so on. So you want to monitor that scenario. I'm in favor of X9 for financial services industry because we're actually producing several things. We came out with a quantum computer risk paper that gets into why it's a risk, what the various quantum computer technologies are currently under development and research, and also gets into what do you need to do, the inventory and identify where all your crypto is. And again, FSISAC is another good source where we're monitoring that. But in the X9 space, for example, an organization can ask, okay, so where am I? How ready am I, right? What's my quantum readiness? What's my level of maturity, if you want? And we're actually developing a post-quantum assessment guideline. And it's not out yet. It's still in draft mode, but we're making some really good progress. And the idea is an organization could use this as a self-assessment. So they could run through the assessment. It's going to be a series of questions, and they could run through the assessment, say, on Monday, and then on the next month or the next week or the next year, they could do it again to see if they've made any improvements. Can they answer more of the questions positively than negatively? The idea is they could also use it with their third-party service providers, give it out to them and have them do the assessment. And so you get an idea of where all your service providers are, how ready are they? And eventually, maybe even some auditors may use this in the future to do an audit of somebody and their post-quantum readiness.
Awesome. What about you, Chris?
So to me, there's a lot of good assets on the PKI Consortium page. They've been doing a fair bit around post-quantum and some compatibility work, which is nice to see. Again, there's no one source today that's great, or complete. I mean, there's lots of different pieces to this and lots of work in progress. So all resources are fantastic. The other one that, from a business leader standpoint, that I think is very strong outside of the assets, of course, we at Keyfactor have, is Deloitte has some really good high-level executive overviews of business preparedness, potential business impact, so on and so forth, out of their team that's looking at how to help organizations get to this quantum readiness state. So, somebody who's trying to figure out how to sell this up, that might be a great place to start, because it takes out a lot of the 4, 5, and 6 letter acronyms and sort of explains it in business terms, which I think is nice to see as well.
Right. And what about you, David?
Yeah, look, I'd probably just emphasize what Jeff and Chris have said, which is that, well, part of what they've said, I don't want to definitely put words in other people's mouths, but yeah, it's a mistake just to concentrate on assets that are available at the moment that just talk about the algorithms. There is a lot of stuff, for example, on this which talks about the algorithms. But yeah, there are papers that have come out of standards bodies like X9, BSI, ETSI in Europe, which also talk about ways of migrating, what it all means, all that sort of thing. So I think it is important to read broadly, not just concentrate on the algorithms, because it's the mechanics of how we use these things is also very important. And yeah, that idea that we're actually starting a journey rather than actually just hitting that sort of Y2K thing of, you flick the switch and it all goes away.
Right.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all. We've gone a little bit over time, but appreciate everyone taking the time. It's been a great conversation. Yeah, and sure we could talk for a lot longer, but honestly, you are all Marvel heroes in your own right. David, you are building the crypto that is going to help us be quantum resistant in the future. Chris, you are helping organizations to prepare all the way up to the C-level. And of course, Jeff, working on the standards with X9 and being a leader there, as well as working with Wells Fargo to prepare the organization for the future. So thank you again all for joining today. And thanks to our audience. Again, feel free to follow up. I believe we have some links in the attachments, so check those out. But again, thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
So